He was considered one of the most effective cabinet ministers in Canadian history. He chaired a panel which eventually led to free trade between Canada and the U.S. and followed that up with a stint as Canada's High Commissioner in London. His life's work is now encapsulated in a new book called Thumper, the memoirs of the Honourable Donald S. Macdonald, and its co-author Rod McQueen is here. And Rod, it's good to have you here at TVO.
Nice to be here, Steve.
Donald Macdonald often said that when he was born, it was the perfect time to be born, that he became a very lucky guy because of the timing of his birth. How come?
Well, he grew up in the 1930s and then ended up to be too young to go off to the Second World War, so he considers himself lucky to have not had to fight. 60,000 Canadians lost their lives in that war. Meanwhile, he was getting educated in Ottawa and following around a father who had a great influence in his life. He was Dominion Forester, and at a time when most young men probably didn't even know what their fathers did, Donald Macdonald's father took him to work and would take him on projects up to where the Chalk River nuclear reactor was to be built, and off to New Brunswick to meet Premier McNair, and really helped him understand politics and public policy from a very young age. So he was born in a great time.
I wonder how much of that interest in politics got, whether the seed was planted when he was a 9-year-old kid and he saw Winston Churchill speak in Parliament. How influential do you think that was?
Well, it was a very interesting event because that was a famous speech that Churchill gave. That was the "some chicken, some neck" speech, and Joseph Karsh had been lined up by Mackenzie King to take Churchill's portrait. That's the one where he looks like he's just lost his cigar, which is exactly what had happened. Karsh pulled it out of his mouth. And Don Macdonald looks back at that time now and says, well, there I was 9 years old. I walked my own path to Parliament Hill to see this great man. And you know, he sort of vaguely remembers being able to see Churchill being bundled in and out, but it was quite maybe a door opening to his future, that he was interested enough that he would just head down there. And of course it was a time when the world was safe enough that you would let a 9-year-old head to a public event like that on his own.
He grew up in Ottawa, really among the elites of the day. Like who?
Well, they lived in Rockcliffe. He went to Ashbury School. John Turner was a couple of years ahead of him before he transferred to a different school. But on his street, Grattan O'Leary was just a few houses away. He was editor of the Ottawa Journal at the time. Both John Ray, who became very close to John Chrétien in later years.
This is Bob Ray's older brother?
That's right, and Bob Ray, who became Premier of Ontario, were just across the way. So there were all kinds of people that went on to become famous.
As I look at his educational background, Ashbury in Ottawa, private school, Trinity College U of T, Osgoode Hall Law School, Harvard University, with Purdy Crawford and Sheikh Yamani, and Archibald Cox, the Watergate special prosecutor, then Cambridge University after all that. You make some pretty good connections, I guess, along the way when you go to these kind of schools.
He had a wonderful education, and he would change only part of it looking back. He wishes now he had maybe spent a year at Laval instead of going to those institutions that you've just listed, where he might have learned French better than he was able to in later life. That was one of the reasons why he never thought he would seek or want to be Prime Minister, because he didn't think his French was sufficient.
Hold off on that, because we're going to get to that part of the story. The title of your book is Thumper, and you know, the assumption is that when a guy's in politics and he has the nickname Thumper, it's because he wears brass knuckles and takes care of business. That's not how he got the nickname.
No, he was at University of Toronto, as you mentioned, at Trinity, and he pledged to a fraternity, and at some point everybody had to have a nickname given to them, and the brother who was in charge of this particular event took one look at him and decided that his size 13 shoes and his buck teeth in those days made him look like Thumper in the Disney movie Bambi. So that's how it all started. It had nothing at all to do with his later life as House leader when he pushed through some difficult changes in the rules there, or as you say, the brass knuckles.
Let's talk about how he got into politics, because he becomes the candidate in the sort of midtown, downtown Toronto riding of Rosedale in time for the, 62? Was that his first election?
61.
61 was his first election. How did he become the candidate?
Well, he worked at a law firm, and his mentor at that law firm wanted him to become involved in politics. He was involved in the Liberal Riding Association in Rosedale. Don had not been particularly partisan growing up. His father was a public servant and so kept his powder dry when it came to what party he might have voted for. So even at university, Don never joined a political club or organization, but his law colleague said, come and join the Federal Riding Association in Rosedale, which he did. Sounded like fun, and he was out campaigning door to door, helping out the candidate, and enjoyed it. And the next election came along, and they wanted to have the name Walter Gordon run in that riding, but the higher beings in the party said, no, Walter Gordon can't run there. Nobody's going to win in that riding. David Walker is the incumbent. The Diefenbaker government was in power, and he was a conservative. Nobody's going to beat Walker. Walter Gordon is going to run in Davenport, where he's more likely to win. So they tried to find other candidates, and they couldn't. And they were finally just sitting around one evening with 8 of them, saying, well, who are we going to get? And somebody turned to Don and said, well, why don't you be the candidate? And well, Don said, well, what's the firm going to say at my law firm? And you leave that to me, the man said. So he was kind of the accidental candidate, but he worked hard at it and ended up defeating the so-called undefeatable
David Walker. He's 30.
That's right.
30 years old,
yeah.
Knocks off a sitting cabinet minister. Diefenbaker wins, and yet he takes the seat away from the Conservatives. He also beat Hal Jackman a few times too, did he not?
That's right. Hal Jackman ended up, I think, running against him 3 times over the years for the Conservatives, and Don won every time until he resigned in 1978. A great run, because the riding traditionally had been conservative, and then after he left, it went back to the Conservatives when David Crombie, the former mayor of Toronto, ran there.
1962 election brings a lot of future stars into Parliament. John Turner, future Prime Minister; David Lewis, future NDP leader; future cabinet ministers Bryce Mackesy, Walter Gordon, you mentioned, Edgar Benson. Diefenbaker is the Prime Minister. How did Macdonald get on with Dief?
They got along very well. It was quite interesting. There was one of Don Macdonald's early questions, first questions in question period, was to the Prime Minister, and he asked about a trade agreement that was being struck with the United States in some area, and Dief laced into him and said, well, you know, you don't understand what you're talking about, and if only you'd read more about this, you'd be better off. And Don sort of was able to ask some sort of quavering supplementary, and Dief flattened him even further. He thought, well, that's it. You know, I'm done. I'm done like dinner. I'll never ever amount to anything in Parliament. And one of the members of the Parliamentary Press Gallery said, well, you know, no, your star is rising. Diefenbaker thought enough about you to take some time to knock you down rather than just be totally dismissive. And a few days later, he ran into Diefenbaker on the elevator going up in the House of Commons, and Dief kind of said, in effect, hello, Mac, how are you? And sort of gave him this nickname, and they had a wonderful relationship ever afterwards. And Don always thought, well, maybe Dief knew that he was a Baptist. Well, growing up, of course, Dief was a Baptist, and maybe he was giving preferential treatment to him as because of that religious denomination. But they had a great relationship and would talk about various things over the years.
1963, the year after, of course, Diefenbaker loses. Lester Pearson's government comes in. 1965, there's a new MP from Montreal elected by the name of Pierre Trudeau. For the young people watching, that's the father of the current Liberal leader of Canada. How did he get on with Trudeau?
Got along very well, and they had an early opportunity to get to know him, because they both ended up at the United Nations the fall after that election as part of the Canadian delegation, giving speeches and trying to get motions through. They both favored changing the regime. At the time, Taiwan was representing China, and the People's Republic of China was not. They wanted to move in that direction. They tried to coordinate this, and they didn't make any progress at that particular time, but it was an opportunity for Don to get to know Trudeau very well, and vice versa. And you know, as he said in Thumper, you know, here I was, I'd grown up reading British books and following that sort of view of the world as seen from Ontario in those days, and here was his first opportunity to get to know Quebec, to understand that province better, and get to know Pierre Trudeau very well.
And 3 years later, when Trudeau runs for the leadership to replace Pearson, who's the first Ontario MP to support him?
Don Macdonald.
Don Macdonald. 2 weeks after he becomes, eventually he gets into cabinet, becomes Minister of Defense. 2 weeks after he becomes Minister of Defense, the FLQ crisis hits. The British Trade Commissioner, James Cross, is kidnapped. So Macdonald has responsibilities now. What did he do?
Well, first of all, they put in some troops in both Montreal and around Ottawa to try to protect cabinet ministers and federal buildings, and tried to calm down the public. The negotiations went on for some days between Pierre Trudeau and Robert Bourassa, the then Quebec Premier, who was weak, really, at the time.
You tell us crying on the phone.
Unresponsive, and this is a story that Don reveals. I've never heard this story before. He, Bourassa was literally crying on the phone to Trudeau, saying, "We need help," and throughout, Trudeau was patient and understanding, and Bourassa just broke down. So that's one of many revelatory items in this book that Don remembers that I've never heard before.
We are still debating to this day, so that's 1970, so 4 decades plus later, we're still debating Trudeau's bringing in the War Measures Act and whether it was a good idea. Did Don Macdonald support that?
He did, and he supports it to this day. And he points out that we've never had any problem with terrorists since, and so therefore, that's certainly proof to my mind as well. There are 2 cabinet ministers since who claim they, spoke up at the time as being against it, but Don has no recollection of anybody around the cabinet table being against the War Measures Act. It was a very difficult time. I was working in Ottawa myself at the time. I was press secretary to Robert Stanfield, working on the other side to Don Macdonald, and those were scary days.
Except that Pierre Trudeau promised us that he would bring forward evidence that there was an imminent armed insurrection that required the bringing in of the War Measures Act. He never did do that. We never did see that evidence. So
Well,
second thoughts?
Well, I think that wording came from Jean Marchand, and I think the promise to bring forward some kind of review was actually made by John Turner. That's my recollection.
Yes, I think that's right. Well, you mentioned John Turner, and of course John Turner in the middle 70s then becomes the Minister of Finance and makes a rather spectacular resignation and leaves public life, and Don Macdonald takes over as Canada's finance minister at a time of 21 straight months of double-digit inflation, wage settlements at 20%. The economy is going to hell in a handcart. What does he want to do about it?
Well, it was a very difficult decision for him. Don's first wife, Ruth, had just been diagnosed with cancer earlier that year. She'd had surgery, everything looked to be okay, but you never know. And he'd actually been thinking through 1975 of not running again and getting out of politics. John Turner suddenly resigns. It's an interesting story that he tells in the book, Thumper, that John Turner didn't even really give any reasons to Pierre Trudeau when he offered his resignation, and then phoned around to everybody to say, the reason I'm leaving is because I couldn't get support in cabinet for anything, which Don says is nonsense. So Trudeau turned to him and said, I need you, and Don took a few days to think about it, and he finally agreed.
One of the most bizarre chapters of Canadian history comes next. We're in the late 1970s. The 1979 election, Joe Clark wins for the Conservatives, Pierre Trudeau loses. Trudeau steps down as Liberal leader. Macdonald throws his hat into the ring to take over. Odd question, but did he really want the job?
No, he didn't. But he'd been talking to Trudeau since the summer, since that July. They met in Toronto, and Trudeau was encouraging him to run for Prime Minister. And Don was reluctant. We've already talked about how he didn't have sufficient capacity in French. But also, Don Macdonald is one of the most honest politicians I've ever met. Most politicians will make up a story to cover some weakness. Not Don. I mean, he sat on the program Question Period, which used to run on CTV, a major public affairs program prior to that, and said, I don't have the royal jelly for the job. was a very honest admission on his part. But anyway, so Trudeau steps down, and a lot of people were urging Don to run. He was really seen as the heir apparent to replace Trudeau. John Turner announces that he's not going to run, and Don was certainly the front runner, and suddenly Trudeau decides he's going to go back after the caucus pressed him. The most relieved man in Canada was Don Macdonald, because he didn't really want the job.
Well, why would you go? First of all, we should explain that the Liberal Party at the time kind of had an unofficial policy of alternating between French and English leaders. So Trudeau having been in, they were looking.
Macdonald was a very likely candidate
Exactly.
on those grounds as well.
Exactly. But why do you run for a job that you say publicly, I don't have the royal jelly for, and I'm not sure I want?
Duty. And the fact that people are pressing you and telling you that only you can do the job. And so he was willing to make a run at it. Maybe he was secretly hoping he wouldn't win at the convention. He didn't tell me that, but you know, you can maybe speculate that. But anyway, he was very relieved when it didn't come to pass. So things worked out.
He was. When Trudeau came back, he was relieved that he didn't have to go through with it.
He was. Trudeau phoned him that morning and said, I'm holding a news conference. Don immediately phoned the key people on his campaign, and he and Ruth and these other key people met for lunch and celebrated, and then they went out and did their Christmas shopping, you know, didn't have to worry about speaking to delegates, able to get back to a normal life. You know, it's a very unusual circumstance, but this is an unusual man who will do things that maybe he doesn't want because he thinks they're for the good of the country, or because other people think they're for the good of the country. He's the first person to be self-deprecating. You know, you've got this man, he's 6'5", and at his peak he was over 200 pounds, so he was quite a presence, and very literate, commanding, good speaker, get things done. But he, of all the people, was the least likely to believe in himself. Other people believed in him more, and again, it was an aspect of his political life and his personal traits that I very much admire.
And 3.5 decades later, when you worked on this book with him, he didn't allow one scintilla of regret that he didn't become Liberal leader and then maybe Prime Minister?
No, he was still cheering about the fact that it didn't happen.
Well, I don't know if you could, well, I should ask you. He may have had more influence in what he did next than anything he did in cabinet. Brian Mulroney becomes Prime Minister in 1984, tasks him with heading up a commission to look at whether we should embark upon a free trade agreement with the United States, and he says yes. How come?
Well, it didn't even start out that specifically. Trudeau appointed him for a royal commission to look into the economy and how the provinces might work together in terms of trade, what the country should look like. There was no particular motive towards free trade with the U.S. In fact, years later, Trudeau said to him, I was never very happy about that. I don't like getting too close to the Americans. And but the idea really came from Don. He started in 1982. There was 13 commissioners, including him, the very typical Canadian panel with regions and genders and academics and union and all sorts of people represented. All manner of research studies were done. They did tours across the country listening to the public, and it was only in the second year of the mandate that Don began to think about free trade. There was some talk amongst the staff, but it was he who gave the first speech where he talked about taking the leap of faith, which was his phrase, that we need to look at doing free trade with the U.S., and that became the final and major recommendation, which was endorsed by all the other commissioners. Mulroney embraced it. Became an issue, of course, in the 1988 election, and the Canadian public embraced it as well. And I think everybody agrees today that it was the right thing to do. We now have $2 billion in trade every day between Canada and the U.S.
And the notion, I mean, politically speaking, the notion of a former senior Liberal cabinet minister giving political cover to a conservative, not always very much liked Prime Minister of the day, I mean, that couldn't hurt either, right?
Well, that's right. And Don, of course, had also evolved. I mean, Walter Gordon, as we were talking about earlier, was a mentor to him. He was a great Canadian nationalist, but even he agreed once this deal was struck and announced. Don got a wonderful letter from Walter saying this was the right thing to do. So I think a whole lot of people were coming on side over the years, but Donald Macdonald led the way.
He ends up going to London, England as Canada's High Commissioner there. How did he like Margaret Thatcher?
He had great fun with her. I think he had a great respect for Prime Minister Thatcher. Of all the people in London that, and by this time, of course, Ruth is dead. He's married Adrian, who had been the wife of Otto Lang, a fellow cabinet minister in the Trudeau government. So Adrian and Donald are now just sort of literally celebrating their honeymoon on this posting to London in 1988. And of all the people they saw, it was really the Queen Mother, the Queen, and Margaret Thatcher they enjoyed the most. It was the three women. Don had a lot of respect for Thatcher in terms of what she had done and her strength in a world that was largely male at that point, the political party.
Didn't he think she was too right-wing for his tastes?
Oh, he might have thought she was a bit right-wing, but I think he had great admiration, and they certainly agreed in terms of apartheid on South Africa. But there was a point, for example, that Mulroney had been looking at buying submarines that would either have been built in Britain or in France. And after 2 years of thinking about it, the Mulroney government decided they would not go ahead with this $8 million purchase at a time of cutting back and closing bases. And so Don went to the Minister of Defense, United Kingdom, and said, I'm sorry to tell you, but we won't be buying any submarine. And the minister said, well, you're very lucky. And Don said, well, why? What do you mean? He said, I would not have wanted to be in your shoes had you had to have gone to Mrs. Thatcher and saying, we're buying the French submarines.
You mentioned the family, and let's just take a moment and talk about this very interesting blended family, because he does marry the ex-wife of a former fellow Liberal cabinet minister, which is, getting pretty unusual there on the face of it. They got 11 kids, I guess, right, when you blend the whole thing together?
That's right.
And I guess one of the more famous members of the family is Amanda Lang, the broadcaster. She's one of the kids that he's inherited now.
That's right. Well, he had 4 daughters, and Adrian and Otto had 7. One of them has since died in an automobile accident, so there are still 6. But it's interesting. They all get along very well. They're all very accomplished in various areas. 2 of Don's stepsons have run unsuccessfully so far for Parliament, so there's politics on all sides there.
As you and he together look back on a life of public service, what does he make of it now, all these years later? Worth doing?
Yes, he says if he was the same age again, he would run for office. I think a whole lot has changed. I think the cabinet that he was in, the Trudeau cabinet, is by far and I say this as a former conservative worker who was trying to unseat Trudeau at the time, I think it's by far the best cabinet, and we haven't had one like it since in Ottawa. I think there are the people who are offering themselves for public service these days, I don't think are of the same high quality. And this is, I guess, part of the partisan bickering that's gone on in Ottawa. People don't want to be there. Maybe people have decided there's other ways to make money or save the world. But from Don Macdonald's point of view, yes, he would run again if he were a young man and probably do just as well, if not better.
But he doesn't like what's happening to politics today. Is that right? Am I reading that between the lines here?
Well, no, there's certainly aspects to it that he doesn't like. He's very much enamored with Justin Trudeau. He thinks that Justin's going to do well. He says that if Bob Rae had become, as he was just interim leader of the Liberal Party, if he had joined the Liberal Party earlier, he very likely would have made a successful Liberal Prime Minister, but there just simply wasn't enough time. But he's obviously a loyal Liberal to this day, and he and Adrian still work very hard on behalf of the party.
Last question. He's now 80, what?
Coming up to 83.
Coming up to 83. How's he doing?
He's doing very well. They're still very active. As I just mentioned, they're certainly active in the party. They're out socially on a regular basis. They have lots of friends, of course, great family events. And he can look around Toronto and see monuments to his time. The Roy Thomson Hall would not have been situated where it is today, or certainly not built as quickly had he not become involved and moved the site. It was going to be further west. He moved it to where it is today. The CBC might have its headquarters and studios in Don Mills. That's what was proposed, and he said, no, it should go downtown, which is where it is today on Front Street. And of course, he was involved in the CN Tower and the St. Lawrence Housing Project. So he's, I think, an accomplished individual, and certainly one who can look around the city of Toronto and elsewhere across the country and say, well, that's part of what I helped to make Canada as the way it is today.
The name of the book is Thumper, The Memoirs of the Honourable Donald S. Macdonald. Rod McQueen, it's so good of you to come into TVO and tell us all about him tonight.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, Steve.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.